Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy. I'm on the marketing team here, and I will be very shortly passing it on to your host. Today, our session is about how one organization turned Microsoft 365 into an EDRMS. And with that, I'll pass it on to our host. First up, Jessica, please introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I am Jessica Dobson. I'm a digital transformation analyst here at Gravity Union. I originally got my master's of archival studies a couple of years ago at UBC. I'm currently the secretary under the Vancouver chapter of ARMA. I've been working in the Microsoft SharePoint and Purview space for quite some time. Working with both on the consulting front and on the public sector as well. So I've experience on both sides of the table. Quick summary of notable clients that I've worked with there, lots of municipalities. So we'll be drawing across a lot of different examples for our presentation today. And I will pass over to my fabulous colleague, Pauline.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, like Jessica, I also attended UBC, but on the other arm of the library school, I did my master's in library and information studies. And I'm a digital transformation analyst here at Gravity Union as well. I've been in the game a little bit longer than Jessica. I've got over 10 years working either as started off my career as like a legal records clerk in the federal government in Canada, and have worked with organizations kind of across all levels of government at this point. We work with both Microsoft Purview here at Gravity Union, as well as Collabware, their products like Collab Space. So background in both of those. And as you can see, again, pretty wide breadth of clients as well. A lot of municipalities, regulators, as well as some private sector and educational institutions as well. Continue on there, who we are. So who are we? Gravity Union is a boutique consulting firm focused on compliance-inspired services. We are proudly Canadian, and as you can see, we're located all across the country. The majority of our team is in Vancouver. I myself are in Calgary, so hello, my fellow Albertan friends. I saw that quite a few of you are on the call today, so nice to see you guys. Yeah, and we've got Microsoft partnership, Collabware partner, as well as you can see there at the bottom, quite a few other organizations in the records world that we collaborate with as well. Pass it off to you, Jessica.
All right, so we'll get into a case study first today, focusing on a Canadian municipality and how they've implemented records management using the Microsoft 365 environment. And then we'll dive into some lessons from the field, pulling from our work with that municipality, as well as broadly across a couple of different clients, to highlight some common issues and our lessons learned from those experiences. We'll wrap up with a quick summary at the end and leave plenty of time for questions. But if you have any that are pressing and relate to anything that we're currently talking about, we're also happy to kind of jump in and spotlight those as we go through. Sometimes it's easier just to address things in the context that they come up in. So without further ado, into the case study. So we're highlighting a Canadian municipality and how they implemented compliant agency-wide records management using Microsoft 365. Quick background about the client. They're municipal government in Canada and serving a large and growing population. To support evolving regulatory and operational requirements, they set out to modernize their records and information management program, dealing not just with physical records, but all of the digital records and how they're being passed around between the different departments within that organization, as well as the public, because as a municipality, they have a lot of responsibilities there. We used a couple different services, technologies. So within Microsoft 365, we focused on SharePoint as our EDRMS, our collaboration hub for all of the files, records, and documents going into and being managed by the municipality. Then we layered on CloudSpace as our lifecycle management tool to copy the content into and preserve it according to the retention lifecycle requirements. And alongside the Microsoft side, we also implemented some Power Automate flows just to help with the collection of documents and how they're processed throughout the city. The more business context and the overall goal of the project, the municipality was looking to enact agency-wide records management while ensuring that compliance was met. So as a public sector organization, they are beholden to various standards across Canada, as well as privacy protection and their response to the public there. So with those kind of compliance requirements at the forefront, they really wanted to make sure that the records that they were maintaining were accurate, up to date, and protected throughout their life cycle. So that was the main focus there. I'll pass over back to Pauline for an overview on the objectives.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. So yeah, the team had three main objectives at this municipality. The first being establish a governance strategy for digital records across the organization. So we worked closely with them in our initial phase of the project to develop strong records management practices with them, including things like developing a RACI, making sure that there was good collaboration across both the records management team, but as well as with the information technology team as well, and making sure that's in a strong partnership there. Their second objective was to improve regulatory compliance through effective retention policies. So in implementing CollabSpace with this team, we were able to help automate a lot of that help to automate those retention policies and make sure that they are in fact being followed in an effective way. Their third objective was to minimize disruption to the end users. So as you guys probably know, a lot of organizations have already shifted into the Microsoft 365 platform, whether it was during COVID or shortly afterwards, because they had need for good collaboration tools. So a lot of users are already in there. They've got products and solutions developed, and so making sure that we're disrupting the end user as little as possible, but ensuring that we're getting those strong retention policies and practices in place, and making sure that the new tool for the EDRMS is being adopted, but with is making as little waves as possible in the solutions and the tools that they're already using. Some highlights from the solution. So we did establish a comprehensive governance strategy with them. So the first phase of the project really is, sitting down with the project team and helping them to establish a governance strategy to standardize record keeping practices across the organization. Like I mentioned previously, that involves things like developing a RACI with them, making sure there's clear roles and responsibilities for the organization, during the project phase as well as into the operational stage of things. The second highlight there, end-to-end RM capabilities with CollabSpace. So this particular client of ours did choose to work with CollabSpace, which, if you aren't aware of CollabSpace, it's a third-party tool developed by a company called Collabware out of Vancouver, and it plugs into SharePoint to provide that records management piece of the puzzle. The municipality adopted it. We implemented an automated retention schedules for end-to-end lifecycle workflow, so it will actually establish those lifecycle workflows and manage the documents both in SharePoint and in CollabSpace, which is an awesome tool. And then third solution to highlight there is pilot configuration and gradual rollout. So typically when Gravity Union works with an organization, and this one was no different, we work with pilot groups first. We selected them for testing to ensure the solution was tailored to their needs. Insights from this helped us with the rest of the org-wide rollout. So we, generally, you in that kind of storming, norming phase of things when you're working with a client, from our perspective, even if you're doing this on your own as an organization, developing that project, that project team, making sure you've got your processes honed in and it works for your organization. It also helps really to help establish things like design patterns and practices that are going to work across the organization. So it really helps to kind of standardize and reduce any kind of friction going forward. So we definitely recommend that. We typically do a retrospective at the end of the pilot phase, just to get some feedback as well from the pilot groups, making sure you're getting perspective just from from the pilot, from the project team, but also from those pilot groups, to make sure you're getting all of the perspectives, and making adjustments to your process as you go. Some project results, organizational alignment. So we did establish a governance roadmap, which provided a clear path for ongoing digital transformation. So, as a project, you come in and you start establishing these patterns, but it does have to continue on, post project. And what does that look like for the organization, and how do you continue to evolve and better your practices? We did establish end-to-end records management. So by pairing Microsoft 365 with CollabSpace, the municipality will achieve seamless lifecycle management and compliance for their records. So we're able to, have users work in place and do what they need to do in their SharePoint environment, and rely on CollabSpace to provide that lifecycle management piece of the puzzle. The third project result there was improved efficiency. So standardized governance and records management processes reduce manual effort and improved operational efficiencies. So, from the records management team, it certainly does help to establish these practices, and the automation helps them to reduce the amount of manual labor that they're doing, to review and process those documents through their life cycle. And then regulatory compliance, which is probably the most important one of them all, is implementation of the automated retention schedules will ensure adherence to the legislative requirements. So it makes sure that they're effectively meeting those requirements in a timely manner for the organization. We will, unless there's any pressing questions about the particular case study, we'll hop over to lessons from the field. So we'll pass on some tips and tricks we've picked up along the way, which is probably really why you guys are all here, is to know, hey, what have you guys learned from your implementations, that you guys can take these away and hopefully use them to your advantage.
Yeah, it all sounds well and good at this point, but how did that actually come together? We have a lot of different tips for you that we felt are useful, especially across a broad variety. Obviously, we're using a municipality as our background for this case study, but a lot of these lessons learned applied broadly according to a bunch of different organizations. So the first one is around change management. This probably isn't the first time you've heard that term, but it focuses on how to minimize the impact of change and friction within a team when you are working with them to evolve the way that they are functioning. So when you're rolling out a records management project, that does involve a little bit of change for the end user. And although we try and minimize that and work with them directly, there's some common practices that we have worked with over the years that we find are really valuable. So the first one is it's quite vital to align your schedules early. So with our process, our rollout process that Pauline was highlighting earlier, we try and interact with the end users, with the group that we are organizing the records on SharePoint as directly as we can. It's really important to get their feedback and make sure that they're they have a voice in how they're uploading and organizing their information. And ultimately, they're the ones that know it best. So we ensure that before we engage with them, because our process is quite direct with lots of participation, we ensure that the business unit has the capacity for change. And what we mean by that is they have some clear air where they're able to take on this shift in their processes. So if there are any other shifts happening in the background, potentially changes to software systems that they're working with, or if they have any annual busy periods like blackouts, if they're taping out with a certain software, if they're an IT team, if there's a lot of vacations, particularly around the holiday periods, this can impact our schedules, as well as seasonal events. For example, with a legislative services team, they'll likely have much less capacity over an election period than a regular year. So we try and strategically place each business unit in a space where they have the capacity to engage with us and provide that feedback that we need. Um, as well, we try and communicate expectations for their involvement and their responsibilities early on. So we're making sure that as they're signing up to take on this shift and work with us to bring their files into SharePoint and then layer on Collab Space, that they understand that their involvement is vital, as they are the information owners, the ones that will be working with this and using it on a day-to-day basis. Um, they understand that responsibility. So that includes scheduled meetings in advance, just to make sure that we're protecting that time, both in our schedules and their own. And as well on this front, it's very valuable to have some executive or senior level support. So if there is a bit of pushback on maybe the timing of things, just a reminder from the executive level that this is a project that is within the heart of the organization and how it functions. So with this municipality that we are working with, it's a core function of theirs to be compliant and to protect their information as well as make it accessible. So having that very clear can help go a long way in aligning your schedules. The next element is along the scheduling front. We do try and minimize the length and the number of meetings while maximizing that value. So it's always a bit of a balancing act. We don't want them to be a drain on people's schedules, but at the same time, nothing quite tops getting everyone together in a room and working through a topic collaboratively. So we have to acknowledge that they're taking time out of their day and their ability to do that real work, their actual job, to meet with us and engage and provide this feedback. What this typically looks like is that we're strategically scheduling meetings. We're planning key touch points where we've identified a overall process for a group. For example, with a financial team, something like budgets that has a broader audience across the entire department. It could also look like for an HR group, an employee file, something that I know a lot of us are familiar as we're employees in some aspect to an organization. That is a process that touches across a lot of different stakeholders and information owners. So when we identify that there is a broad audience, we try and have some key touch points with that group, just to make sure that everybody, again, has a chance to have their voice heard, as well as provide that feedback on how they are structuring the information in SharePoint. We also try and remain flexible. So when it's possible to have specific members within that broader audience that are a stakeholder in a particular part of that process. So going back to my earlier example of budgets, for an approval at the end, that would be the main manager, or with employee files, maybe the recruitment team is the process owner for that initial creation and onboarding process. So when we have that parsed out, we're meeting with them more directly without the broader audience, just to gain their specific specific requirements, allow them to test their aspect of the solution and understand their responsibilities when it comes to migrating, putting that information in the system and how that is shaping up at the end. Alongside this overall engagement rollout, we do layer on quite a bit of training. So these are an excellent example of a standardized session where we're going over essentially the same information. So in this, we are able to offer a couple options for each of the business units, either across different teams or across different departments, depending on how much we are rolling out with the group at the time, to allow them to pick a time that works best for them in their schedule, but still participate in the training and understand all of the basics of SharePoint and the information systems that we're using so they can confidently use the system and adopt it once we're through. Throughout this, we do try and remain flexible in terms of absences. So vacations, sick leave, those kind of things pop up. People retire, people go on leave. You need to make sure that you are flexible in your audience and make sure everybody is aware of both their roles and have a couple in the wings as kind of background. So if a team has one person, we try and identify maybe a fallback person or a key power user for the group that can kind of speak to multiple areas for the team. We include optional placeholders. These can also be space if there are additional conversations that come out of our sessions and we need to dig a little bit deeper into something like requirements gathering or testing. We have a little bit of extra lead time there, so we can use those if we need them and then cancel them if we don't. So we're still minimizing the overall number of meetings while maximizing the value there. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good reminder to always be mindful of others' priorities too. As much as we're trying to work with them and get their feedback, they have a lot going on in the background. So if there is any big vacations or anything like that coming up, just keeping those communication channels open. Which segues right into the next point here. We always try and keep open channels throughout the entire process, as well as vitally towards the end when they are finally adopting the solution. So we're making sure that we're checking in with them and we're not necessarily asking them to do a major shift, do that migration, and then let the system just kind of sort itself out. Oftentimes, it's quite common for end users to discover new requirements after they've had a chance to try out the system for a couple of weeks. So if you picture us like a waiter coming by to check on your meal, it's important to check back in just to see if there's any changes that are necessary at that point. The flip side of that is there is a risk if we're not checking in and really capturing those extra requirements or fine tuning, they will find a different way of accessing their information and storing it if the current system is not working for them. So full adoption does take some time and does require a little bit of polishing up at the end, just to make sure that everybody is happy with the final solution. So we try and keep those communication channels. We schedule a couple check-in sessions as well as emails, Teams chats, whatever works best for the team, just to make sure that we're on the same page. Those further tweaks can look like creating new libraries, renaming existing libraries if they suggest that there is material that hasn't otherwise been captured in a different location. We can add on additional metadata if they recognize that this is actually a large volume area and they need to organize it a little bit better. So if you notice, especially if there's an over-reliance on nested folders, a lot of the time we can eliminate some of those and collapse it a little bit by using metadata instead. And this allows them to both sort and search and find the information in a flexible way. It can also look like streamlining the navigation. So SharePoint is a powerful tool. We do have several articles on SharePoint pages and how to design those in ways that work for the team. It allows you to link out to things that aren't just within the Microsoft space. So if there are any particular systems, tools, references outside of the organization's SharePoint that you need to include on the navigation, it helps to make the SharePoint site the home base for the team so that they know all of the different systems that they need to jump off of. They can start from SharePoint first and see any of those examples there. Identifying roadblocks as early as possible is key. If you notice there's a delay in migrating files or if there's some pushback or friction there, some business processes require uploading or downloading information from other applications, for example. So you can work with the team just to highlight ways that we can make the tool a little bit more useful. So for example, a shortcut to OneDrive is an option on a SharePoint library that allows you to create a little bridge between the SharePoint library and its access across all of the different team members and the individual's OneDrive, where they can download and open the file in an external application more seamlessly. So that can be a helpful tip there. If there is a high volume of information going in, so if they're trying to upload all active contracts, for example, or all employees, you want to make sure that you are doing it in stages so that they understand maybe a date range is happening first, or for example, with contracts, the key vendors that you're working with actively at the current time are a priority versus more historic content. Sometimes it's a need to support on when to use document sets. So those are a key way in a SharePoint library that you can associate metadata onto a bundle of related documents. So they act like a superpower of a folder. And sometimes the shift just requires a little bit of extra communication so that the users understand when they're supposed to be using document sets as opposed to that more traditional nested folder structure. Ultimately, no records in the SharePoint or in the system means no records management is being applied, as we're trying to centralize all of the information in one place so that we can associate all of those powerful automated retention classifications in the background. So this is a crucial step and does require a lot of flexibility, open communication, just to make sure that everything is happening smoothly. All right, we have a break now. We're halfway through our session, so we thought it'd be a great time to get some engagement. I know some of you have been working on SharePoint already, so you might have some feedback on what issues you've heard with adopting SharePoint. We have some choices for you to select if any of these speak for you. So Amy is going to launch that. Perfect. Feel free to select multiple if you need to. And otherwise, if you have any additional statements, you can drop them in the chat. This is just to spark some conversation. Again, we're among friends. Everybody is dealing with very similar problems, most likely. So we can work with potential tips and tricks there.
While you guys are responding, I just want to add a last comment to that. The last point that Jessica was making about no records means no records management happening. That also means it's much harder for you guys to test your records management. If there's nothing in there, it's much harder for your queries if you're using Purview, or I guess your content rules if you're using Collab Space to actually go and find the records. So it's in your best interest as well as theirs. To get those records in there right away.
So we've got about 50 responses. And surprise, surprise, only 6% of folks say there's no issues and that SharePoint is flawless.
One of those was me.
Oh, there we go. So even less than that. And then we're split on issues being with finding files or nested folders or file path limits. So quite a bit to discuss here, I think.
We've got it. We've got an additional one too. We've got Angela said permissions can easily degrade over time. Yeah, that one's a tricky one too. Maybe we can speak to that a little bit. We'll answer a lot of this, I think, when we get to the kind of Q&A at the end. So we'll leave that for now, but we will definitely address that one, Angela, when we get to the Q&A.
Good break. There we are, back on track.
Thank you. Okay, so our next tip from the field is identifying retention triggers. So we'll take a lot of examples or context from the case study that we're using today, but a lot of these are things that we've learned from other clients as well. And Jessica and I have experience with both Collab Space as well as Purview. So if you've got Purview specific questions too, please do let us know. If we have any kind of tips on that, we'll try and add those into as we go, just because we know quite a few organizations are using that. And so we want to make sure that we're giving kind of as much examples and experience as we can pass along in this short amount of time with you guys. So what are retention triggers? So retention needs to start at a point to kick off the countdown clock for electronic records. So for electronic records, this needs to be specifically defined to align with classification schedules with the day-to-day work of the end user. So when we're looking at digital records, it's a little bit of a different life cycle than when we're looking at paper records, for example, or even records in like a network drive where you're manually kind of managing that life cycle. We need to take into account when we're applying records management directly to where people are working on the records, that there is typically a point in time where they're actively working on it. So at Gravity Union, we call this the collaboration window. So it's what's the point in time when end users are typically working or actively working on and developing those products. It could be, a day for something like an invoice. It could be months for something like, policy development. It could be something like years for a project, right? So we need to be careful about when we are actually starting that time clock. Typically, for things like, a contract, for example, it's, at the end of the contract or when the warranty has expired. So what time is that happening? For other things like, a SOP, it might be, once it's finished, we're going to manage it until we no longer need it. Okay, well, approximately how long do we typically need that file? So finding, what is that point in time that we actually want to start the clock for the retention? So typically we're looking at, a collaboration window. We have that kind of navy blue bar. That's where our trigger point. And then we have that active and semi-active stage, which we typically see laid out in our retention schedules prior to the disposition process actually happening. So that navy blue bar is what we're looking for when we're looking for retention triggers in a SharePoint environment. Our tip number one for this one is take advantage of the system's information. So, use out-of-the-box system managed metadata as much as possible. Things like created date or last modified date can be really helpful and also helps to reduce the amount of times we are reliant on an end user to fill in information. If it's not of value to the end user, they're probably not going to fill it in. So using the system information can be really, really helpful to us. It's more intuitive for an end user. It's reliable. It always has to contain a value. The most reliant thing that we can do for our RM staff is to rely on things that don't require an end user to trigger it, or for a records management person to come in and have to trigger a manual event. That also takes time and effort for a records management person to remember to do that, to schedule the time to do that regularly in their time, and then actually have to go in and manually do that. So if you can work into your workflows or into your retention, using things like created or last modified, you can really start to rely on those and reduce the amount of extra effort that you have for your team. So something like an invoice, for example, they typically aren't worked on regularly, right? You kind of receive an invoice or you create an invoice and it's complete. You don't really need a long period of time afterwards. So say you have to keep that for 7 years, you might be able to go from created date plus 7 years. That maybe doesn't exactly align with the language in your retention schedule, but it aligns closely enough that your life cycle will line up with what the intent is of your retention schedule. So you do have to do a little bit of thinking when you're adapting your retention schedule to the digital environment, because they typically aren't written in a way that directly aligns with how we're actually working with the managing records. So thinking about, hey, if I set this from created date, is that probably pretty good? Or is it something like a last modified? So something like an, like an SOP where I might work on it for a month or two until it's established, and then maybe it's 5 years from the last modified date is a good point in time when we're checking in and seeing, hey, are we still using this? Or have we if we've updated it since then the clock restarts. So things like that can help to reduce the amount of extra effort you have on your part and the end users. Tip number two here. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead, trying to count extras. Standardize and recycle. So common metadata columns can be reused across business units or record types. So regardless of the record system, defining a strategy for consistent columns early makes configuration smooth. So whether you're using collab space like our case study did, or you're using Purview like a lot of other organizations, you will at some point require some custom metadata columns to help trigger retention on specific types of records. So establishing some key date-related columns early on and using those repetitively throughout your rollout will really help to reduce the amount of things that you have to keep track of, really makes it standardized, easier for configuration for you as well in either of these systems, and just make sure it's a common practice. So if people move from one part of a department to another, it's the same kind of language that they're used to using. So example columns could be, effective date, close date, completed date, meeting date, adoption date. Those are general enough language that you can use it repetitively throughout your rollouts without them being so vague that the people don't understand what to do with them, right? So if I have, effective date on a policy, probably people are going to understand effective date is when this policy became an active policy, right? So using it in context, most people can figure out what is the purpose of this field, and then you can use that to start the retention on the documents. Choice fields can be used as well, but are often harder to standardize between teams. So things like statuses, there's always nuances. People are like, well, I want draft, in review, second review, ready for approval, and final and canceled. And someone else might just say, hey, I just want draft, in review, and final. So there could be other variations. It's a little bit harder to standardize those, but they can work. There can be limited, they can also be limited based on the solution. So Purview or collab space. So Purview is a maximum number of 20 refinable dates. You do have to map date fields to your search schema in Purview. So 20 dates that you can use to maximum across your entire environment. 100 refinable strings, so things like choice fields, you can use them, but you have a max of 100, and that's for your entire tenant, right? So it's not just what you're using for records management, it's for everyone who may be potentially using those. So it's not a very high limit when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. So having standardization really helps to reduce your overhead use of those. And then, each column needs to be mapped to a refinable property to be used in any kind of query in Purview if you happen to be using it. So keep that in mind. In collab space, using things like choice field can help you to direct what type of record you're using, but it can't help to start. It only uses date fields to start the retention. So that's a bit of a limitation there. So understanding what the limitations of your particular product that you're using as you start to standardize is also a really helpful thing to keep in mind, is that I need to know what I'm able to do and what my limitations are before I start to establish these. it's really good learning throughout that pilot process for sure. Tip number 3 here, make it useful to end users. This may not come as a surprise to you guys, but most people don't care if a document is superseded. We may, as a records managers, care about, when was this is this document obsolete? Is it superseded? Most people are just going about their day. If they have moved on to something new, they're not going back and checking off that this is superseded. There may be the odd case where someone, in a policy kind of development role might care about that. But for a lot of the time, you need to make your columns useful to the end user. So choose columns that make sense and is useful to the end user. They're much more likely to fill them in if you do need something like a date field, right? So if I'm in contract management and I have, contract end date or warranty end date on my contract, I'm probably going to fill that in because that's really helpful for me to come in and just see, hey, when is this contract ending? Do I need to do anything additional with it? When's the warranty end on that one? Those are really, really helpful tools for me as a contract manager. So it's also going to be really easy for me to fill that in and find it useful. And that means as a records manager, I'm getting the information that I need. So using those tools and making sure they make sense to the end user and it's helpful to them in their processes is a really good way to kind of slide in there and make sure that you're going to get the information you need to, if it is absolutely imperative that you have some kind of triggered date inside the SharePoint environment. Yeah, when you have to rely on those, it's really, really helpful to have it be something that they themselves are going to find useful too. So finding out, learning about their business processes is really going to help you to establish those and make those recommendations for them, and then also kind of keep within your own standardized practices as well. All right, this just quick disclaimer here. This is a demo, not the live site of the client that we're talking about here today, the case study. This is a legislative services bylaw library just for you guys to kind of see an example here. So you can see there, we've got adoption date in the library. That's one that you could use across many different environments. In this particular case, we're talking about bylaws. Bylaws are typically permanent, so we may not need a date trigger, but we can still use it here to help them understand what's going on with their bylaws, right? So they can see this is the bylaw, this is the bylaw number, you can see the bylaw type it is, the bylaw status, if it's been approved, they can see when it was adopted, all really quick, clear information from them. And that type of information can be used in records management as well, like that adoption date. If we needed to, we could potentially, if we're using something like Collab Space, which can help with archiving some records, or, as they like to call it, archiving. It's not literally archiving them. You can help to, maybe move these to Collab Space only after 15 years and retain them there. So helping to kind of use that adoption date as a date of like, yeah, we haven't used this for, so many years. We're going to move this into Collab Space only for the remainder of its life. So you can use dates for things like that in here, but you can see this is bylaws in a municipality. If you yourselves work in a municipality, you may see this and go, well, I wouldn't need to know what the bylaw type is, or those aren't the types I have. It could be very different depending on what the organization needs. But using some standardized ones regularly will help you guys in your practices. Pass this off to Jessica for some key takeaways here.
So hopefully there's been a lot of useful lessons learned here. We've summarized them for you. If there's one thing that you remember from our hour session on the change management side, align the schedule to each business unit's capacity, making sure that you are acknowledging that this is taking a lot of time out of their day and really making sure that they understand what areas that they need to provide information on. Keep meetings lean and manageable. So where you can, open them up broadly so that you're getting a broad perspective of responses, but where you can, just focus in on key personnel and key departments just to get the requirements from them. and then keep communications open after go live, especially so that they are successful at the end in uploading their records. On the retention trigger side, lean on the system managed metadata like the created and last modified dates as a kind of baseline, or for especially things like transitory. And as Pauline was saying, like 7 years from created date, as these are the reliable ones that you can depend on having a value as they are system managed. Try and standardize and reuse columns across the teams, business units, and record types so that you're lessening the impact on the configuration at the end, and making sure that that is a successful adoption. Lastly, pick triggers that are generally useful for them so that end users are ultimately going to use them and see the value as well. All right.
Cool. So, Angela, yeah, and Will or Cameron, sorry, piled on that with permissions. So permissions can easily degrade over time, and Cameron added on not as much a records issue, but in my experience, it ends up an RM responsibility to manage the permissions. So two really good points. Permissions can be difficult to manage if you don't have well-established practices, and you don't have well-established roles and responsibilities within an organization to manage those or to assist in managing the permissions. So typically what we recommend is building a much flatter architecture when you're looking at building within SharePoint. So instead of having really nested, where we may have in the past, if you used past SharePoint or you're using a network drive, you have quite nested layered structure. We tend to go quite broad in our permissions. Or in our design. So you may have a site for, and I'll use a records management site for example. So I've had a client that had, they've got a records and information services team, right? So they've got FOI and privacy in there as well. They may have a site for just privacy, a site for just FOI. They may have a manager site in there. They may have a site just for records. So establishing quite broad sites across that particular department, all held together with one hub site and singular navigation. So branching out wider and establishing clear permissions at the top at the site level helps to reduce the amount of times that you have to break permissions. So managing it at the highest level possible is really helpful in ensuring that you're not getting a bunch of broken permissions. The other thing I would say is establishing, as you're designing your SharePoint sites, thinking about the content up front and saying, okay, well, who do you actually work with on this? Is it just your team, or do you need to share a good chunk of this content with a broader audience, or is there a chunk of this content that needs to be more restricted, and housing those in separate sites to begin with so that you're still establishing that at the top level. And then from there, just a good amount of training as well. So we typically do in our process, we do about 4 hours, I think, of training with the end users. And at least, an hour and a half of that is on sharing and permissions and how they work and how sharing works, so that people understand that every time they're sharing a document, they're giving permissions and they're breaking it. So helping them to establish practices inside the organization as you start to work with these departments about good, hygiene and practices when they're sharing, so that reduces the amount of times that you're getting these broken kind of snarled permissions over time. Obviously, it still happens as people share documents, but if good education and good design up front help to reduce the amount of times that you're getting that. And then getting to Cameron's point there about it often becomes records management responsibility, like that gets back to your kind of initial stages of rolling things out and establishing good roles and responsibilities and making it clear, who is responsible for, the security of the solution, if that should be within the IT department and having people submit, IT requests to adjust permissions, or as we kind of do typically in our in our projects, it's typically a bit of a hybrid where we have site owners owners managing the membership of their team site and managing it for their own teams. And then if they're looking to establish, you know, an entire other department has access to our site, then they're looking to IT to help manage that permission and that, you know, external access to things. Anything to add to that, Jessica?
No, that was, yeah, awesome. It's an evolving thing, especially as people use SharePoint and share things out. But as much as we can include default permissions that make sense for key business processes in the location itself is ideal.
I guess one other thing we typically do is we have one site that is a group connected Microsoft 365 group connected site, and that one is typically the hub for that particular department, and then you use that Microsoft 365 group across all of the other associated sites. That also helps to reduce the amount of touch points you have for managing the permissions and allows you typically like the manager of that department to manage who is in and out of their own department, and so it reduces hopefully the amount of times that people they're looking to you guys for support on that.
All right, I'm just commenting on a couple of them. If we don't get to your question or if you have time to stay on the line, you're welcome to. We can also respond via email afterwards. So just to dive right in, Tanya asked on the retention triggers, have you encountered pushback on staff wanting to keep everything permanently just in case? Absolutely. There's always the temptation, especially when you're working with groups that have been using SharePoint for a while. The default is essentially permanent because we haven't applied retention. So that's what they're used to having, and being able to just go back and reference all of those past files as you need to. So it can be a bit of a balancing act, putting in date fields like completed, effective, that still has value to them, but aligns with your retention schedule. You can remind them that they do typically want to filter out anything that isn't either complete or effective when they're searching for things. So the more that they're accumulating and hoarding, the longer it will take them to actually find those records and determine if it's the complete or effective version. As well, if you do really have a lot of pushback, bringing in the big guns on the compliance perspective, rarely are they allowed to really keep everything permanently. So just that gentle reminder of you do need to include some disposition at some point. Amy asked how you would handle records that have been previously brought into SharePoint from elsewhere and therefore have an upload date that's different from its true created date. There is some time, there is, like, if you're using a specialized migration tool, a way that you can pull forward that true created date from the source system. But if you are just using the upload button on a SharePoint library or drag and drop method to upload files, then it will just consider it a fresh new version of that document as soon as it hits a SharePoint library. So in this case, using, again, custom date fields like complete or effective will help you set a value on that particular record, although this does require a little bit more kind of manual effort combing through and assigning that date on each file. So there's a balancing act there.
You might want to take into consideration what is the risk to the organization to keep it for whatever the retention period is from that date versus the amount of effort it's going to be for you to, you know, backdate it by adding a particular, you know, date field, or going, you know, if you're using something like Purview, going and creating an event to trigger the event and establishing that like date in the past for them. There's, you know, quite a bit more effort to that versus, you know, what is the risk if we just keep it for an extra 2 years based on, you know, the new solution, you know, added date versus, or the new date in the new solution in SharePoint versus the date it was in, you know, a network drive, for example. I think we are at time. If I have a few extra minutes if there's really some pressing questions, but I'll leave it to you, Amy, if you want to wrap up and we answer via email.
Yeah, I think that there's a few folks I had to jump off as well. I realize we're at time. Thank you so much, Pauline and Jessica. What I will commit to is I'll work with the both of you to get us some written out answers for the majority of these questions, and we'll send them in the follow-up email that all of you will get. So again, thank you so much, Jessica and Pauline. Excellent session. Sounds like we might need to turn this into a blog post and some other content because it's clearly a hot topic. And
Mhm.
thank you everyone again for joining. We will have all this information out to you ideally by the beginning of next week. So yeah, thanks again, Jessica and Pauline, and thanks everyone for joining.